Hello, everybody. Welcome to our conversation today. This conversation is part of a celebration of 30 years of the UN Development Report, the Human Development Report. We are looking at lessons learned from the past, and then how do those lessons get applied to the future via a conversation? What is essential in this conversation? We have a politician, we have an activist, we also have an academic, we have you, of course. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little box which says Q&A. I am looking forward to hearing your questions for our lineup, and you can put those questions to the lineup at any point during this conversation. I'm not going to silo you right to the end, because we have learned many things over the last 30 years, and siloing is one of them that we would like to avoid. My name is Femi Oke. I will be your moderator for the next 15 minutes. But first, let me introduce you to your lineup. Let's start first with the politician. Hello, Madam President. Hello, Laura. Please introduce yourself to our audience. Tell them why you're important in this conversation.
Hello, Femi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us. And first, let me say some words about the Human Development Report Office. I want to congratulate them for drafting the most relevant report on development issues for 30 years. And I want to say that this report alerted very early that gender inequality was one of the most significant barriers to human development. While I am a political scientist, a politician from Costa Rica, who had the honor to break the glass ceiling in 2 occasions in my country, 25 years ago when I was appointed as the first female Minister of Security, and in 2010, when my people elected me as the first woman president. I have been concerned about gender equality for many years. And during my government, we were able to achieve parity at all levels of education, reduce femicides by 70%, to provide early childhood care for working mothers, and some other kind of measures. Although I already retired from politics in Costa Rica, I am still very active on issues concerning the global agenda, such as multilateralism, sustainable development, women empowerment, and other things. It is a pleasure to be in this panel today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. I want to tell everybody that Madam President said I have to call her Laura. So don't send me comments about me not respecting her title. I am under orders and I cannot disobey. Hello, Kalyani. It is so great to have you in this conversation. Tell our audience why you're in this conversation. Good to see you.
Hi. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm Kalyani. I'm a feminist activist and I am based in New Delhi in India. So I'm one of those feminists who got drawn into the global development sector by the promise of the Human Development Framework that for a complete rethinking of the meaning and purpose of development. It was actually the 1995 HDR, the gender HDR, that made me think that I could play a part in that transformation. Whatever questions might be around that original promise of transformation, I still feel that the Human Development Framework can be a powerful platform for those of us who believe that the dominant paradigm of development is itself the problem and has to give way to something new. So I feel very privileged to be here in such distinguished company. And I want to thank the host for bringing me to this conversation.
It's good to have you. And Michael, welcome to the conversation. Please tell everybody who you are. I will allow you to humble brag. Go ahead.
My name is Michael. I'm a researcher at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. So it's 1 o'clock in the morning here. I do research on men and masculinities, on gender and violence prevention. But more than just only producing good knowledge, I also try to contribute to social change. So I participate in social movements, I tweet, I provide public commentary, I give away the books I've written and so on. So, I try to be a researcher, an advocate and an educator. And look, it's an honor and a privilege to be part of this conversation.
So audience, you know who your panelists are. So get ready with your questions, your comments. I'm looking forward to seeing them in the Q&A box. But before we start our dialogue, our conversation today, I want you to meet Pedro Conceição. He is the director of the Human Development Report, 30th anniversary. He's very busy. Thank you for making time for us, Pedro. Go ahead.
Thank you, Femi. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us on the panel and online. Just reiterate that we chose the challenge of gender inequality for this dialogue because this has been a recurrent theme in human development reports from the very beginning. Kalyani mentioned the 1995 report, which had this very important phrase, in my view. It said that human development, if not engendered, is endangered. And that is as relevant today as it was in 1995. Last year, we had the Human Development Report that focused on inequalities in human development, but had a spotlight on gender inequality. And we introduced a new index of social norms on gender inequality. And today, we celebrate the International Day for the End of Violence Against Women. I want to remind all of us of one of the most shocking findings of that index. We found that almost a third of people around the world think that it is justifiable for a man to beat his partner. We also found that 9 out of every 10 people around the world harbors a bias against gender equality. And more shocking of all, perhaps, we found that in many countries there is a backsliding in terms of social norms that support progress towards gender equality. And I'll just conclude by saying that the moment we're living now with the COVID-19 pandemic is actually exacerbating not only patterns of gender inequality, in part because the economic sectors more affected by the pandemic are ones in which women are often overrepresented, but also because, going back to social norms, we see some evidence that traditional views on women's role, on household responsibilities, childcare, education, are reasserting themselves. And so there's evidence that women are actually pulling back from the labor market, not only because jobs are being lost, but because of these social norms. And in times of crisis, social norms tend to become harder, more entrenched. And I think this is a reason for concern, because it builds again on this backsliding of gender norms, of social norms against gender equality that we documented last year. But it's not a destiny. We have a choice. We need to continue to shine a spotlight on the challenge, but also to discuss what can we do all to make improvements on gender equality. That's what human development reports will continue to do going forward. And I very much look forward to the discussion to help us in that regard. Thank you, Femi.
Thank you, Pedro. Where are we heading with gender equality is the headline for this conversation. Kalyani, Laura, Michael, I know you all have thoughts on this. Kalyani, can I start though with you, and then other panelists, you can talk and bounce backwards and forwards with your ideas as well. But Kalyani, this idea of where we are with the Human Development Report, we were at 30 years, marking its anniversary during a global pandemic. And our focus today is gender equality or gender inequality, same conversation. COVID-19, if you draw the link between COVID-19 and gender equality, where do you want to take us?
No, I agree with Pedro, Femi. I think COVID really has been the crisis. It's kind of jerked the carpet out from under the denialists, the status quoists, those who've convinced themselves that a rising GDP will lift everybody's boat, who believe that rights and justice are impediments on the road to prosperity. COVID has actually left them all flailing. So put simply, what I think COVID has done is to make visible the connections between, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, and the crisis of democracy. So this is really the triangle of crises, which is within which we are kind of operating at this point. And I think what COVID has done is to make these crises and the connection between these crises evident in a very stark and undeniable way. Now, my point is that feminist analysis has actually made these connections visible, and at least for the last 30 years, feminist thinking has developed a conceptual framework to unpack them. And women's movements, feminist activism over these last 30 years has actually exposed the alliances between patriarchy and other hierarchies of power and privilege. So it's these intersectional hierarchies that have created these interlocking crises. And the most terrifying symptom of this crisis, as Laura said and as Pedro said, is really the global resurgence of violent, masculinist, exclusionary political ideology. So I think this is a moment that COVID has focused and shown us exactly what peril we are all in.
Michael.
Yeah, look, I'm really pleased to hear Kalyani's account, and she's absolutely right that really, feminism could have told us for 3 decades that pandemics like COVID play out in the context of gender inequalities and often make those inequalities worse. And we've seen that, very clearly in countries around the globe. And I think that part of what's gone on here is about masculinity. Look at the resistance to mask wearing in some countries, particularly among men. Look at the kind of tough man or strong man leadership we've seen from some countries that's led to hopeless or disastrous responses to COVID. Look at the way that some Western governments prioritise male-dominated areas of industry in terms of economic recovery, manufacturing and construction, rather than recognising the value of care and health and education and so on. So pandemics are never gender neutral. We saw that with HIV/AIDS, and now we see that in really challenging ways with COVID as well. Some people say that COVID also potentially opens up new opportunities for change, that large numbers of men now finding themselves at home, perhaps caring for children or seeing the work that's involved in running a household may take that up. I'm not sure if we'll see that or not, but certainly there's no doubt that that COVID takes place in the context of and has made worse systemic gender inequalities.
Laura, COVID's impact globally has been huge. It didn't seem as if we were prepared for a global pandemic and what it would do to us, what it would do to women, what it would do to families.
Well, yes, I will say that nobody was prepared for this kind of pandemic. However, at the same time, I will say that this pandemic has treated in a very different way those who were more vulnerable to those who had, more access to opportunities and resources. And in the case of women, it is very clear from a policy perspective that there is still many things to do to support women's agenda in many fields, economically speaking, socially speaking, and also politically speaking. Just let me give you some data to illustrate what I am saying. First, informality in the labor market is mainly in the hands of women all around the world. It goes from 60 to 80%, depending on the countries. So that means that the pandemic puts women at a greater risk of falling into poverty or not having access to social protection mechanisms. Secondly, women are working, when they are formally employed, working primarily in the sectors that are among the first to be affected by lockdowns. So that was another kind of message that we had to receive from a policy point of view. Third, most of the health workers are women. So that means that they are more exposed to the effects of the pandemic. And finally, two more issues. Women have less access to the use of technology tools than men. So that will means that the pandemic will probably result in more women losing their jobs. And finally, what Christine already mentioned, and that is that the confinement measures expose women to higher levels of gender bias violence. So when we analyze the global agenda, we can see very clear during the pandemic how behind is women in terms of human development.
Panel, let me put this question to you. This question comes from Professor Mohsin Abul-Naga, and you can answer it in different ways. Where are the highest gendered inequality versus equality recorded rates in our globe during the age of COVID-19 crisis? We haven't even had a year of COVID. We've had enough, but we haven't had a year. So this is going to be very new in terms of what data do we even have. So I'm okay if you answer in the way of examples, anecdotal, because to have data from, say, March for many of us, maybe from December if you're in China, that is tricky. That's a hard question to actually answer. But how would you talk to the professor about that? Where's the higher gender inequality? Where have you seen it? For instance, Laura, you brought up, and I have seen this, and I've seen the numbers, that women are leaving the labor force faster than men are leaving the labor force. There's an impact economically that COVID-19 is having on workforces, but women are leaving in bigger numbers than men. That is one example that I am seeing, and there are stats certainly for the United States for that. Kalyani, what do you want to add?
I was thinking about what you said, that we don't really have data to be able to say this in a huge way. I think what we can say definitely is that in every place where certain disparities existed or certain gaps existed, those gaps have widened hugely. And in places that have been worse hit by COVID, as well as by where democracy itself is tottering and where authoritarian masculinist governments are in power, in those places, these violations and disparities have increased at a much faster rate. So I'm just thinking of the sort of global understanding now that countries with women leaders, New Zealand is the country most often quoted. Countries with leaders who have a different approach, who may or may not identify as feminists, but who have a different approach to managing the crises, have been able to contain its social impacts, particularly in terms of violence and in terms of inequality, much better than countries that have taken a top-down command and control kind of non-consultative approach. So I do see that it's not just the impact of COVID, but it's also the impact of governance structures and the way in which the crisis is conceptualized. In many countries, the COVID crisis is being conceptualized as a law and order problem. So in my own country, we've seen the government enforcing some really draconian measures, using the police to implement these measures, rather than having a dialogue or a conversation with the public to make sure that everybody understands why certain things have to be done. And Michael gave the experience of mask wearing. I think in the US also, we're seeing the same thing, this kind of sharp positions, polarized positions on mask wearing, with very little understanding of why this is important.
So Dr. Rakia is watching, is part of our conversation today. He is watching, and he said, "Rightly said, ma'am." Michael, please.
Yeah, I really like what Kalyani said, and there's a number of countries, I think, where COVID has been used by governments to kind of intensify backlash against reproductive rights, against more social democratic agendas to do with care, and to intensify a kind of militarized police and security, control over the population, and authoritarian rule. And I'm not necessarily thinking of countries outside the West either. Threats to democracy are certainly visible, in the US, which is a country that, my own country pays lots of attention to. The other thing I'd say is, it would be great in some ways if, governments and others recognize the way that COVID is intensifying gender inequalities, and therefore this pandemic were an impetus to more social democratic and more feminist informed political agendas. But in fact, we sometimes see things going precisely the other way, even when that involves a sort of, massive cost in terms of deaths and illness in the population concerned.
Speakers, our conversation, the headline, which is a really interesting headline, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which speaks to the 30 years of the Human Development Report, the gains, and then the losses, and where are we right now? If we're talking, Laura, and staying off obviously with gender equality or inequality, if we're talking about society's norms and how they have changed or maybe stayed the same, if we're looking for wins, where would we look to? What have you seen that's given you hope?
Well, this is a very important issue, an issue that was highlighted by the Human Development Report last year. And I would say that according to the research included in the report, there are 4 concerns in terms of social norms, because we have to recognize that many good things have happened during the last years in favor of women's rights, but there is still many concernings, and most of them are associated with the role of social norms. So let me just mention some of the concerns that we highlighted. They highlighted. I was part of the board, so that is why I speak in third person. But the first concern is that progress in gender equality is slowing, and this is linked to an apparent backlash against greater gender equality in many countries, and due to the role played by social norms. The second is that the bias against gender equality intensifies in areas where more power is involved, either at home, in the workplace, or in politics. The third concern is that the problem is widespread, since, as Pedro mentioned in the introduction, only 1 in 10 men and only 1 in 7 women show no bias at all against gender equality. And finally, the problem is far from diminishing. It tends to grow, since the proportion of people having a bias against gender equality has grown in recent years. So that means that we have to do much more in terms of policies. For example, working with the socialization of boys and girls within the families, in the education. Try also to see what is the role that both traditional and social media are playing. And finally, we have to be more, we have to do even more in accessing to power. That is very critical if we want to fight this kind of obstacles that we still have in the road.
Michael, your work is very practical. Your work is with men and boys and changing the sort of gender norms that exist so that there isn't gender-based violence, so that there is more awareness. As you're working with them, what have you learned about how gender norms are changing or maybe staying the same?
Sure. Look, I mean, the Human Development Report is actually a great piece for taking that temperature of both men's and women's attitudes around the globe. And as Laura summarised, it shows a slowing of progress towards gender equality. It shows that, most people, particularly most men, have some kind of sexist bias. They agree that men make better political leaders than women, or that a job should go to a man rather than a woman, and so on. What that report also tells us is that there's been stagnation and backlash. It's got this amazing chart, actually, that shows where overall attitudes towards gender equality improved over the last, I think, decade or decade and a half, and where they went backwards. And so it's not a story of even progress or of even backlash around the world, but certainly what's very troubling is large numbers of men and fewer numbers of women opposed to gender equality, supportive of patriarchal arrangements where men dominate. But in terms of sort of gender norms to do with men in particular, there's one thing I'm really pleased to see is there's growing awareness of how harmful masculine norms shape men's lives, including shaping men's own health and well-being, but also shaping the violence and abuse that some men perpetrate against women and girls. And if we focus on that, again, we see that there's been some improvements over the last decade or two. Most surveys in most countries show that fewer men these days agree that a man has a right to hit his wife. Fewer men these days agree that a man should be the head of the household or dominant in the relationship or family.
But Michael,
what's really troubling is it's still reasonably substantial numbers.
And also, that's what stood out when Pedro said a third of men.
Yeah, that's right.
A third of men right now think it's okay.
Yeah, and look, it's not just about norms. I mean, one of the reasons that harmful masculine norms, a belief that violence is okay, for example, stay in place, is because of other social systems and social structures. The norms in a community or a society, what we think other people do, what we think other people expect, they don't just float around like clouds. They're linked to our social institutions. They're linked to how boys and girls are raised. They're linked to patterns of power. So if we want to shift those social norms, we're going to have to make other forms of social change as well, because social norms are embedded in social institutions, in hierarchies of power.
Kalyani, can I give this question to you from our audience? How can gender-sensitive policy making contribute to better socioeconomic prospects in developing economies?
For me or for Kalyani?
That's a very hard question to answer off the top of my head. But I want to pick up on what Michael was just saying and talk about this whole notion of gender-sensitive policies. I want to go back to your original point, Femi, about the gains and what has been achieved. And I want to look at the development world. So there's definitely been a huge, huge achievement in the sense that the way that gender has been put on the map in the development world is very powerful. It's kind of been accepted as a non-negotiable condition for development. So no document, no declaration, no policy is acceptable unless it accepts and kind of pays homage to gender equality as a development goal. But the point is that we have not been able to ensure that these words become reality on the ground. And I want to link back to what all of us are saying about the persistent gap and the definite decline in indicators of equality. So we've made gains, but these gains have been achieved at a very high cost. The citadels of power within the institutions of development are intact. Sexism, racism, homophobia, colonialist, majoritarian worldviews, biases, all of these are deeply embedded in the system. And the control of global policies and decisions, whether at the global level or whether at the national level, remains in the hands of a very small and very exclusive club. So at one level, I even see the focus in the development world on shifting social norms as shifting the attention away and the responsibility away from institutions of development. Now, in such a situation, to ask what would be the best way to influence policies, I would say, it really is sweeping the map clean and starting again from scratch. Because as things stand now, the transformative goals of gender equality, the transformative
Kalyani, you just dropped a verbal grenade in our conversation. I just want to pick up. What would you sweep clean? What needs to go?
I think the development industry needs to be asked to retire.
You know, Pedro is sweating right. You know, Pedro is sweating right now. Okay.
I think Pedro may well agree with me. I mean, the way that patriarchal binaries, gender hierarchies of value are really enmeshed in the language of development and the practice of development. And this is what human development reports have been raising in different ways. So the goals of gender equality and women's rights have been absorbed, but they've also been diluted, they've been depoliticized, and they've been converted into interventions that actually fit very neatly into the dominant paradigm. So that transformative goal of human development and of a changed paradigm has been subverted. So my gut feeling is that Pedro would probably agree with me that it's time to stop saying we want to change the rules of the game. I think we need to change the game.
Can I ask, who are the agents of change there? I mean, should development agencies be, should they be throwing their lot in with grassroots feminist and social justice movements? Is it those movements and actors like that will be able to make the kind of real political or social change that is necessary? It's Kalyani I'm asking.
Oh, that is
great. I would like to say something else, because yes, I think what Kalyani are saying is very important. Because at this time, for example, international financial institutions are offering many resources to respond to the crisis. But at the same time, according to the UNDP tracker, only 20% of the nations or the governments are putting in place gender-sensitive kind of measures to respond to the pandemic. So the question is, why do we don't ask the international financial institutions to condition the resources so we can be sure that part of those resources are going to be allocated to respond to these very complex issues that women are suffering all around the globe. So I think that we have to move from the words to the facts.
Kalyani, I'd still love to hear from you.
I wanted to say, Michael, I'm just thinking how we need to really break our own conditioning of thinking that there's some kind of small, tight set of solutions that can be adapted and applied in various situations. I think what we've learned, what you and I and Laura and everybody else who's worked on gender equality has learned, that the complexity of these different experiences of oppression, of resistance, of submission, of solidarity. So all of these multiple systems of privilege, whether it's sexism, racism, classism, casteism in my country, ableism, homophobia, whatever, you name it, religious bigotry, the way these play out and the situations they create, the actors they enable, is so different and is so completely grounded in a particular context. I think we have to find ways to allow those contexts to find voice. And that's where the experience of New Zealand is really interesting, because what seems to be happening there, and I speak as somebody who's just reading about it, I have no connect with anybody who's there. But what seems to be happening is a genuine effort to give voice to each group or each community or each local formation to articulate its own positions, its own analyses. You see a lot of this happening in Latin America also, especially with in countries where indigenous movements to save the environment, movements for a different model of development. Some countries, there are spaces being created to at least acknowledge that there can be no global solutions. There is no central headquarters that has some special wisdom that tells us what is best in multiple places.
Okay.
It's that notion that got us into this mess.
The final part of our conversation takes us back to the beginning of our conversation. Where are we heading with gender equality? I had a look on Laura's website, and she is on the website shaking hands with female leaders. I know this is not an accident. I am getting the messaging. There's Angela Merkel, Laura and Angela Merkel. There's Laura and Hillary Clinton. There is Laura and who else was there, Lloyd, did you shake hands with? Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel. Oh, Michelle Bachelet. Okay, like big, powerful women. So where are we heading with gender equality? I'm going to ask you via Veronica Lucko, who has this question. Veronica says, when you have political party leadership consisting mostly of men, they are the gatekeepers to elections and changing power structures. Laura, I know you are deeply passionate about this. You are messaging about women leadership. Help us get to where are we heading with gender equality with women's leadership? Start us off.
Well, again, I think that we should try to move, not abandon at all, because we still have many things to do, but we have to move from the concerns about women's rights to the concerns of women access to power again. If we are not there, it's going to be more difficult to change the course of the events. And let me just use the pandemic, and Kellyanne already said something about this, but I want to use the examples of the pandemic to justify why I understand that more women leadership is needed now. Because when we see that despite the fact that just a few governments are headed by women, according to the data, it is, I mean, those few governments, 40% of the cases are having very successful handling of the pandemic. And I think that this is not casual. The good results have largely relied on the quality of female leadership, because there are some common features of leadership. Women first tend to display a distinctive approach to power. It is a less arrogant attitude, much more willing to listen and to confirm policy with respect and discipline to technical and scientific criteria. And this is a moment when politicians have been forced to abide, like probably never before, to science and experts. Secondly, women have an ability to be empathetic, to identify with others, people's feelings and needs. And this is also a moment where the conditions of leadership, such as compassion and solidarity, are being put to test. And finally, women's collaborative leadership style is well suited to coalition building and dialogue, much necessary conditions in moment in which leaders need to bridge social divides to build political cohesion and consensus, as opposed to polarizing and devising approaches to governing. And so in my case, I mean, I can't find a better way to explain than using the examples we have at hand during the pandemic. Most heads of states, female heads of states, are doing a very good job And this is not casual. This is because there's a different style of leading in the case of women.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen those articles. So New Zealand was cited as doing a good job with COVID. Germany, although there has been another peak with COVID, was also cited as doing a good job with COVID. And these are places where they have women leadership. Let me just go back to Veronica. She's got a very specific question for you. Can we see differences in countries with higher percentages of women in the legislature as being fairer than countries with less? Do women in power make a difference as far as gender equality policies are concerned? Those two things don't always go together, Laura. Quick answer to that, please. Yeah, go ahead. Do we see a difference in equality with more women in power? Laura's quiet. Maybe she cannot hear me. All right, let me just move on a little bit. Laura, can you hear me? Go ahead.
Yes. No, excuse me. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes. What Veronica wanted to know is, if you have these women in power, women leaders,
Yes.
Do you see a difference in gender equality policies? Are the countries better?
Yes, of course. You know, I have had the opportunity to talk to some of them. I have been in contact with many of them for many years, and it is very common to find that women is more concerned about the social conditions of people. So in certain way, we decide about economic policy, about infrastructure policy, about technical policy in terms of the social impact on the different sectors, and even the most vulnerable ones. So you can find differences, but also you can find important programs in terms of more political participation of women into politics. Looks at the case of Latin America. After we had 7 women leading different governments, now we don't have, that is true. But after that, in most of the Latin American countries, you were able to get 50% or parity in Congress. And that was because those women in power, those presidents, were supporting the new leadership. So now, although we don't have women presidents, we have 50% in many countries of young women in Congress, and they are the future probably presidents of many Latin American countries. So the answer is yes, there is a difference.
The answer is yes. Excellent. All right, Michael, I want to come back to you and your work, because when we talked earlier, it was your work that you felt would help in terms of making progress towards gender equality. And your work is working with men and boys to reduce gender-based violence. Can you capture what it is that you're doing and how you would share that philosophy with our audience?
Look, for this forum, I suppose I'd say that the most surprising thing that's happened in terms of gender and gender equality over the last 2 decades, I think, has been the resurgence of a backlash, the kind of intensified, male-dominated movements and even governments that really show a kind of hyper-masculine set of beliefs and a kind of authoritarian, patriarchal, understandings of gender. And no one predicted that in the 80s, the idea that things would go backwards in such a significant way. And I think that engaging men and boys in productive, discussions about gender and in fostering healthy masculinities is a key preventative strategy there. So I and others, yes, my work is in part to prevent men's violence, but part of that is also about lessening resistance and backlash. Because I think if we leave, for example, young men to their own devices online and elsewhere, then growing numbers of young men will continue to be radicalized, not radicalized into violent extremism, but into sexist extremism and, in fact, forms of violence as well. So I think that to make progress towards gender equality, one strategy, it's not the magic solution, but one thing we will have to step up is to engage men and boys in ways that can address the anxieties and insecurities that some men feel, but can offer alternative, healthy models of manhood or of personhood that can be part of gender equality.
Guess one of the things that I've noticed from the questions, thank you everybody for your questions, they're excellent. Several questions on supporting grassroots activists, civil society movements, scaling bottom-up approaches, and engaging marginalized groups of women. It always concentrating in a very similar area. Kalyani, do you want to start with that, about what you would advise? Because people are coming to you because you're all brilliant in your different fields. But if we're talking grassroots up, what advice would you give people?
I feel completely unequipped to give advice, but I just want to say that what we are realizing, and when I say we, I mean the women's movements in India, of which I'm aware and I'm a part, many of us are realizing that what we need to do is to build bridges between different movements and between different streams within the women's movement. So we need people in dialogue with each other to really understand the way in which the system works. So we've got a very powerful environment movement, a very powerful climate justice movement. We have powerful women's movements. We have movements for civil rights and political rights. But I think the ways in which we talk to each other has been, I mean, if one was being really mean, one would say transactional, but we have not been able to work together to develop our understanding of what needs to change and how we can work together to change it. So at the grassroots, this is a powerful impetus now, and it's not just in our country, but across the world, the connections between movements are growing stronger. So if you look at the Green New Deal, the groups that are coming together around the Green New Deal, you have people from all different movements, and not just women either. So there are a trade union, there are workers' movements, there are women's rights movements, there are masculine, men's rights, and men for pro-feminist men's movements, all coming together, because I think really what all of us are understanding in our different ways is that we need a different paradigm. How do we get to that paradigm? How do we get to a point where we articulate that paradigm? I mean, we are clear on what we want. We want a development system that acknowledges, that respects the connections between land and life, between the market economy and the economy of nature, the economy of care, between the home and the outside world, between economic relationships and relationships of care.
Right.
We want a paradigm that sustains these relationships and that puts equality, justice, peace, well-being for all, and survival for the planet at the center.
Right.
So how to get there is really the challenge. And I think all of us grassroots groups in our different ways are trying to advance that conversation, widen that dialogue.
I have a challenging question for you guests for the very end of our conversation. So it's a thought, the first thought that comes into your mind. I will accept that, because then we're going to wrap up. The inspiration is Christina Boylan from New York Polytechnic Institute. Thank you, Christina, for the inspiration. Christina was wondering, what action plans can we take to rebuild economies and societies post-COVID that do not recreate gender inequalities? Like, this can be your wish list. It can be fantastical. It can be, if only we use this opportunity of this global pandemic to do this. What would this be? It is a sentence. So it is really projecting what is possible, the future, bearing in mind where we are with our global pandemic. Laura, what would you say?
It is not an easy question, but I would like to say two things, one about human development and one about democracy. Concerning human development, it is very clear that we need to allocate more resources, more attention to women issues in every country, in every nation. we are talking about having access to these kind of advanced capacities, and not only these capacities, as the Human Development Report very clear explained last year. And concerning democracy, which is at the stakes during this year, I will say that if we want more women in power, we must defend and protect democracy. Autocratic and populist leaders undermine democracy, and this works against women's leadership. So the cause of democracy is deeply a feminist.
All right, thank you so much. So I really appreciate your presence in our conversation today. Michael.
I really liked Kalyani's succinct, passionate manifesto. It reminds me of those notions of feminism for the 99%, and I think that's a very inspiring vision. We need a human rights and social justice agenda. It has to be grounded in community, and whatever we do, it has to be done in partnership with or led by women's rights groups and movements.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate your participation today. Kalyani, your sentence, what would it be? Projecting into the future. It could be something you've already said. I think it might be. Go ahead.
Develop and call for a policy framework that dissolves the separation between the monetized economy, markets and production on one side, and the maintenance economy, that is natural resources, care, and human life on the other side. Just dissolve.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guests. Thank you so much, audience, for your excellent questions and engagement. Really appreciate you. This has been a UNDP production. And if you want to follow the 30 years anniversary of the Human Development Report, look out for it on social, hashtag 30 years of HDR. This wraps up our conversation for today. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Bye.